The emergency beacon had been silent for 3 days when Marcus finally heard it again a week. Irregular pulse cutting through Europa's atmospheric interference. He paused his work on the water reclamation system, frost-covered tools slipping from his gloved hands as he listened to the distress pattern, repeating from somewhere beyond the ice fields. Marcus had been alone at Research Station Omega-7 for 8 months now, ever since the Colonial Authority deemed the outpost non-essential and recalled his team. He'd volunteered to stay behind, officially to maintain the equipment, but truthfully, because he had nowhere else to go. Earth held too many memories of failure, and the other colonies required credentials he no longer possessed after the incident that had ended his career. The beacon pulsed again, closer now. Marcus grabbed his thermal scanner and headed for the observation deck. Through the reinforced viewport, he could see nothing but endless white stretching toward Jupiter's looming presence on the horizon. But the scanner picked up something else, a heat signature moving erratically across the ice, leaving a trail of disturbed snow in its wake. Whatever it was alive and heading directly toward his station. Marcus descended to the airlock, his breath forming small clouds in the recycled air. The heating system had been running at minimum efficiency to conserve power, leaving most of the station barely above freezing. He pulled on his environmental suit, checked the seals, and cycled through the outer door. The figure stumbled into view just as he emerged onto the platform, humanoid, but clearly not human. Her skin held an unusual lavender tint that seemed to shimmer even through the blowing snow, and her proportions were slightly elongated, more graceful than earthly genetics would allow. She wore what appeared to be some kind of ceremonial garment, now torn and inadequate for Europa's harsh environment. She collapsed to her knees in the snow, looking up at him with eyes that glowed with an inner light, not the harsh glow of technology, but something organic, desperate. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the thin atmosphere, her words somehow perfectly understandable despite clearly being from no human language. "Please," she gasped, her accent musical despite her distress. "I know what you must think, but I need your help. My people, we bond through emotional connection, physical intimacy. It's how we survive trauma, how we heal. I've lost everything, everyone. You're the first being I've encountered in weeks who isn't trying to kill me." Her voice broke slightly. "What do I have to do to make you understand, to make you want to save me?" Marcus stared at her, processing what she'd said. The universal translator implant all colonial workers received was advanced, but this felt different, like she was speaking directly to some deeper part of his mind. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said finally, extending his hand. "Come inside before you freeze." She looked at his offered hand with surprise, as if kindness was the last thing she'd expected. Slowly, she reached up and took it. Her fingers were cold but not lifeless, and he could feel a strange energy passing between them at the contact, not electric, but somehow warmer, more intimate. Marcus helped her to her feet and guided her through the airlock. Once inside, she collapsed, again, this time from exhaustion rather than cold. Her skin had taken on a bluish tint at the extremities, and her breathing was shallow. "Medical bay," Marcus muttered, lifting her carefully in his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body seeming to have a different density than human flesh. As he carried her through the station's corridors, she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling gradually subside. The medical bay was one of the few sections still running at full capacity. Marcus placed her on the examination table and began running basic scans. Her biology was fascinating, similar enough to human to register on his equipment, but with subtle differences that spoke of an entirely different evolutionary path. "Your species," he said as he worked, covering her with thermal blankets and checking her vital signs. What are you called?" "Zephyrian," she whispered, her voice steadier now. "I'm Zara. We were explorers, diplomats. My ship was part of a cultural exchange mission when the hegemony found us." Her expression darkened. "They don't believe in what they call emotional contamination. They've been systematically eliminating species like mine, ones that form deep bonds, that rely on connection for survival." Marcus nodded, his hands working automatically to treat her exposure injuries. "And you escaped?" "Barely. I've been running for months, jumping from system to system, My bonding abilities kept me alive. I could form temporary connections with other refugees, traders, anyone willing to help. But it's not sustainable without. She looked away, embarrassment coloring her features, without deeper intimacy. True bonding, it's not just physical, it's emotional, psychological, a complete sharing of self. And that's what you were asking for when you arrived, Marcus realized. Not just shelter, but connection. Zara nodded, meeting his eyes again. I know how it must sound. A desperate alien throwing herself at the first person she meets. But it's how my people survive trauma. How we heal from loss. The deeper the connection, the stronger we become. She paused, studying his face. You're not disgusted by this? Marcus considered her question carefully. Where I come from. Connection is something people struggle to find. The idea that it could be necessary for survival, even healing, that doesn't sound desperate to me. It sounds human, in the best sense. Something shifted in Zara's expression at his words. The defensive walls she'd been maintaining seemed to lower slightly, and her natural luminescence grew brighter, warmer. You're not what I expected when I sent out that distress call, she admitted. Most beings react with either fear or exploitation. When they learn about Zephyrian bonding practices, you're treating this as normal conversation. Maybe because nothing about my life has been normal for a while, Marcus replied. Checking the readouts on her medical scan, your cellular structure is stabilizing, but you're still running on reserves. You need rest, proper nutrition. He paused. And probably the kind of connection you were talking about. Though I won't presume. I would like that, Zara interrupted softly. But only if you want it to. Not out of pity or obligation. True bonding requires genuine desire from both participants. Marcus looked at her, really looked, despite her exhaustion and the trauma she'd endured. There was strength in her features, intelligence in her glowing eyes, and something else that stirred something long dormant in his chest. It had been over a year since he'd felt any kind of meaningful connection with another being. I'd like to understand, he said finally, to learn about your culture, your people. And if that leads to something deeper. He trailed off, realizing how inadequate human language seemed for what she was describing. Zara smiled then, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her. Her skin's luminescence pulsed gently, and he could feel that strange energy again, stronger now. Like a warmth spreading through the air between them. Understanding is where all true bonds begin, she said, reaching for his hand again. This time, when their fingers touched, the sensation was electric, promising, full of possibilities neither of them had dared hope for in their respective isolation. Outside, Europa's storms continued to rage, but inside the station something new was beginning to bloom, fragile still, but growing stronger with each shared glance. Each moment of genuine connection between two souls who had found each other across the vast emptiness of space. The ancient Martian caverns stretched endlessly beneath the planet's surface, their walls carved with symbols that predated human colonization by millennia. David Chen had spent the last 3 years cataloging these markings, trying to piece together the language of Mars' long-dead civilization. What he hadn't expected was to find someone else down here, someone very much alive. Nyx pressed herself against the cavern wall. As David's headlamp swept across the chamber, her violet skin almost blending with the purple-hued rock formations. She had been studying these same symbols for weeks, trying to decode what appeared to be ancient bonding ceremonies. When the human had stumbled into her sanctuary, "Please don't run," David said softly, recognizing the fear in her posture despite her alien features. "I'm not with any military or colonial authority. I'm just a linguist." Nyx's silver eyes studied him carefully. Like all Altheans, she could sense emotional resonance in other beings, and this human's intentions felt genuine, curious rather than threatening. Still, she kept her distance. "You study the old language," she said, her accent giving his words a melodic quality. "The symbols speak of connection rituals, of bonds that transcend physical form." David nodded, excitement overriding his caution. "You can read them? I've been working on translations for years, but some concepts don't seem to have human equivalents, because your species bonds differently," Nyx replied, stepping slightly closer. "The Martians, like my people, understood that true connection requires vulnerability. Shared consciousness. Your translations miss the emotional context. She moved to one of the wall carvings, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. This passage describes the ceremony of souls where two beings share not just their bodies, but their deepest thoughts, their fears, their dreams. It creates a bond that can last lifetimes. David approached slowly, his academic excitement warring, with an unexpected attraction to this graceful being. My people have similar concepts, but we've complicated them, made them about ownership rather than sharing. Nix's expression softened. The hegemony calls our bonding practices primitive emotion. All dependence. They've outlawed such connections, claiming they weaken us. That's why I'm here, hiding in these ruins. You're a refugee, David realized. I was an anthropologist on my home world, studying interspecies cultural practices. When the hegemony invaded, they destroyed our bonding temples, separated our pair bonds. Her voice grew quiet. Many of my people didn't survive the forced isolation. David felt a surge of protective anger. I'm sorry, that's monstrous. It's systematic. Nix corrected. They fear what they can't control, and they can't control genuine emotional connection. She looked at him directly. Is that why you're alone down here? Have your people also forgotten how to truly connect? The question hit deeper than David expected. I suppose I have trouble with intimacy, physical, emotional. It's easier to study ancient languages than to navigate modern relationships. NYX moved closer, close enough that he could see the way her skin seemed to hold its own inner light. The Martians believed that knowledge without connection was hollow. They thought scholars should be the first to understand true bonding. What would that look like? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering directly, Nix placed her palm against one of the carved symbols. It began to glow with soft phosphorescence, and suddenly David could feel something, not his own emotions, but hers: curiosity, loneliness, hope, and underneath it all, a desire for the kind of deep understanding she'd lost when her world fell. Altheian touched telepathy. She explained, we can share what we feel, what we know. It's the foundation of how we bond. David stared at the glowing symbol, then at her. Could you teach me? Nix smiled, the expression transforming, her features from merely beautiful to radiant. Learning requires practice, and practice requires trust. Over the following days, they worked together in the caverns, David sharing his linguistic knowledge while Nix taught him to read the emotional layers of the ancient texts. Each translation session brought them physically closer, their hands touching as they traced symbols, their minds gradually opening to each other. This section, Nix said one evening, her finger following a particularly complex glyph, describes the physical aspects of Martian bonding, the way touch can convey what words cannot. David's hand covered hers on the wall. Through their contact, he felt her pulse quicken, felt her desire mixing with his own. Show me, he whispered. Nix turned. In his arms, her silver eyes reflecting the phosphorescent glow of the symbols around them. Altheian bonding begins with the mind, she said softly, placing her palm against his forehead. The sensation was overwhelming, not just her thoughts, but her memories, her culture, her species' understanding of intimacy as something sacred, healing, transformative. David felt his own barriers dissolving, his analytical mind quieting as something deeper took over. They sank to the soft sand of the cavern floor, their bodies coming together with an urgency born of mutual understanding. Nix's skin grew brighter as their intimacy deepened, her biological responses creating patterns of light that danced across the ancient walls. When David entered her, it was with more than just his body. Through their mental connection, he experienced her pleasure as his own, felt her joy at finally finding someone who understood what her people had lost. Their lovemaking became a translation of its own, converting loneliness into connection, isolation into union. Afterwards, they lay entwined in the phosphorescent glow, their minds still partially merged. David could feel Nix's contentment, her sense of completeness that went beyond physical satisfaction. The Martians were right, he murmured against her skin. Knowledge without connection is hollow. Nix smiled, her hand tracing patterns on his chest. And now you understand why the hegemony fears us. This kind of bond makes us stronger than the sum of our parts. David kissed her forehead, tasting the slight metallic sweetness of her skin. Then we'll have to make sure they don't find us. They won't, Nyx replied confidently. These caverns have protected lovers for millennia, and now they protect us. Above them, the ancient symbols continued to glow, as if approving of this new bond formed in their shadow a human and an Althean, proving that some connections transcend species, time, and the fears of those who would keep beings apart. The biodome facility had been abandoned for over a decade, its automated systems maintaining a jungle of earth plants that had long since grown wild. And strange in the artificial environment, Thomas had come here seeking rare botanical specimens for his research, not expecting to find anyone else in the overgrown paradise. He heard her before he saw her, a low moan of pain echoing through the dense foliage. Following the sound, Thomas pushed through curtains of hanging vines to find her collapsed beside a small stream, her indigo skin pale with shock and pain. Vera clutched her side where dark fluid seeped between her fingers. Her species' blood was a deep purple, almost black, and there was far too much of it staining the moss beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, labored, and when she looked up at Thomas's approach, her golden eyes were clouded with agony. "Stay back," she gasped an accented standard. I'm dangerous when I'm hurt. My people. We react unpredictably to trauma." Thomas knelt carefully beside her, his botanist's knowledge extending to basic field medicine. "I'm not going anywhere. You're bleeding badly. What happened?" "Hegemony Patrol," Vera whispered. "They found my research ship in orbit. I escaped in a pod," but she gestured weakly at her wound. Shrapnel from the crash. Thomas could see the twisted metal embedded in her side, and his expression grew grim. "This needs immediate attention. I have medical supplies back at my camp, but moving you might make it worse." "Then don't move me," Vera said, her voice growing weaker. "Just, if you have any compassion, don't leave me to die alone." Something in her tone made Thomas look more closely at her face. Beyond the pain, he saw a deep weariness, the exhaustion of someone who had been running and hiding for too long. Her golden eyes held the same loneliness he recognized in himself. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Vera. I was a healer before. My people, the Nexari. We have the ability to accelerate healing through physical contact, but it requires..." She trailed off, embarrassment mixing with her pain. "Requires what?" "Intimate touch. Deep connection. It's not just about the physical contact. Our healing abilities are tied to emotional bonding, to trust and desire." Vera's breathing grew more ragged. "I haven't been able to heal properly in months. No one wants to risk that kind of connection with a refugee." Thomas understood immediately. "You're asking me to help you heal, but it means becoming intimate with you." Vera nodded weakly. "I know how it sounds. A dying alien asking a stranger for the most personal kind of help. I wouldn't ask if..." She coughed, more dark blood appearing on her lips. "If I wasn't desperate." Thomas looked at her. Really looked. Despite her injuries and alien features, she was beautiful in a way that stirred something deep in his chest. More than that, she was brilliant. He could see it in her eyes, hear it in the precise way she spoke even through her pain. And she was dying. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. Vera's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "The healing requires skin contact, emotional openness. I need to feel that. You truly want to help me, not just out of obligation. The connection has to be genuine." Thomas moved closer, gently brushing a strand of her dark hair away from her face. "You're not just asking for healing, are you? You're asking for trust, for someone to see you as more than just a refugee or an alien." "Yes," Vera breathed. "Nexari. Healing draws on both participants' life force, their emotional energy. It creates a bond between healer and patient. Then let's create that bond." Thomas carefully helped Vera out of her torn clothing, his hands gentle as he exposed her wounded side. Her skin was warm despite her injuries, and he could see faint bioluminescent patterns beneath the surface that seemed to respond to his touch. "I need to remove the shrapnel first," he said softly. "This is going to hurt." Vera nodded, placing her hand over his. "The pain will help focus my abilities, as long as you're connected to me when I heal." Thomas worked carefully, his botanical precision serving him well as he extracted the metal fragments. Vera's grip on his hand tightened with each piece, but she didn't cry out. Instead, he could feel something passing between them, not just her pain, but her gratitude, her growing trust in his gentleness. When the last piece was removed, Vera's breathing was even more labored. "Now," she whispered, I need you to touch me, not just my wounds, but everywhere. The healing draws from every point of contact." Thomas understood. This wasn't just about medical treatment, it was about intimacy, about two beings connecting on the most fundamental level. He leaned down and kissed her softly, tasting the metallic sweetness of her blood, but also something else, something that spoke of alien flowers and distant suns. Vera responded to his kiss with surprising strength, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck as their bodies pressed together. Thomas could feel warmth spreading from every point where their skin met. The bioluminescent patterns under Vera's skin grew brighter, more complex, spreading from her core outward. "Yes," she breathed against his lips, "I can feel it working. Your life force, your desire, it's accelerating my cellular regeneration." Thomas looked down and watched in amazement as the gaping wound in her side began to close, the torn tissue knitting itself back together at a visible rate. But more than the physical healing, he could feel something deeper happening, an emotional connection forming between them, built on trust and mutual need. "This is how my people court," Vera whispered, her hands exploring his body with growing confidence as her strength returned. "Healing and bonding are the same process for us. We cannot love without the ability to heal each other." "Then heal me too," Thomas said, surprised by his own boldness. "I didn't realize how wounded I was until I met you." Vera smiled, her golden eyes bright with renewed health and something deeper. Nexari healing works both ways, especially when there's genuine attraction between the participants. She pulled him down to her, their bodies joining with the desperate passion of two beings who had found something precious in each other. As they moved together on the soft moss beside the stream, Thomas could feel not just physical pleasure, but actual healing, old emotional wounds closing, loneliness transforming into connection. The bioluminescent patterns under Vera's skin pulsed in rhythm with their lovemaking, creating a light show that reflected off the water and the surrounding plants. Thomas felt stronger, more alive than he had in years, as if her healing abilities were working on parts of him he hadn't even realized were damaged. Afterwards, they lay together in the dappled light filtering through the dome's canopy. Vera's wound had completely healed, leaving only the faintest trace of a scar. But more importantly, the exhaustion and despair that had clouded her eyes was gone, replaced by contentment and hope. "Thank you," she said softly, tracing patterns on his chest, "for seeing me as more than just a desperate refugee." Thomas kissed her forehead, breathing in her unique scent of alien flowers and ozone. "Thank you for showing me what real healing looks like." Vera smiled, her whole body glowing faintly with health and happiness. "This is just the beginning. Nexari bonds deepen over time, becoming more powerful as trust grows." "I'd like that," Thomas replied, pulling her closer. "I'd like to learn more about your healing arts, and I'd like to learn about your botanical research," Vera said. "Perhaps we can find new ways to combine our knowledge." Above them, the automated systems hummed quietly, maintaining the artificial paradise that had brought them together. Neither mentioned the hegemony patrols still hunting for refugees, or the uncertain future facing all who dared to form the connections their oppressors feared. For now, it was enough to have found each other, to have discovered that healing and love were not separate things, but different aspects of the same fundamental force that connected all living beings across the stars. The derelict space station drifted in the dead zone between Mars and Jupiter, its hull scarred by meteor impacts and years of neglect. To most travelers, it would appear to be just another piece of space junk, but James Morrison knew better. Hidden within its seemingly dead systems was a sanctuary, a place where refugees and outcasts could find safety from the hegemony's relentless expansion. James had been maintaining the station's life support systems for 2 years, using his mechanical expertise to keep the ancient machinery functioning. He'd grown used to the solitude, but when the docking bay sensors chimed with an incoming vessel, He felt his heart rate quicken with anticipation. The ship that docked was barely functional, its engines smoking and hull plates loose. The pilot, who emerged, was a draconian woman with scales that shifted from deep emerald to silver, depending on the light. Her movements were precise despite obvious exhaustion, and her amber eyes held the sharp intelligence common to her species. "I'm looking for sanctuary," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the slightly hissing accent of her people. "I was told this station offers safe harbor." "Depends on what you're running from," James replied, though he was already moving, "to help her secure her dying ship, and what you can offer in return." "I'm Kira," she said, watching him work with professional appreciation. "Formerly chief engineer of the Draconian Defense Fleet, now a traitor to my own species for refusing to participate in the hegemony's campaigns." James paused in his work. "That makes you welcome here. I'm James, station engineer, and apparently your new roommate." Kira's scales shifted to a warmer gold tone, which James had learned indicated either amusement or approval. "Roommate? How?" "Domestic. The station's big, but most of it's uninhabitable," James explained, leading her through the corridors. "I've managed to restore life support to about 30% of the original structure. You'll have your own quarters, but we'll be sharing common areas." They passed through sections of the station that spoke to its former grandeur, vast observation decks with floor-to-ceiling viewports, recreational areas that could have housed hundreds, engineering sections filled with technology from a dozen different species, all of it now dark and cold, kept barely functional by James's constant maintenance. "This was the Harmonist Station Nova Prospect," Kira observed, running her clawed fingers along a wall panel. "I studied their engineering principles at the Academy. They believed different species could work together, share technology and culture." Past tense being the key phrase, James said bitterly. "The hegemony made sure of that." Kira stopped walking and looked at him directly. "You're not just a maintenance engineer, are you? You understand these systems too well." "Speak of them too personally," James sighed. "I was part of the original crew. When the Harmonists were dissolved, most of us were reassigned. Some of us chose to disappear instead, and you stayed here alone all this time." "Someone had to keep the lights on," James said simply. "And I hoped that someday people would remember what this place represented." Kira's scales shimmered with what James was beginning to recognize as admiration. "The same principles that made me desert my post. Some things are worth preserving, even if it costs us everything." Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Kira proved to be an exceptional engineer, her draconian physiology allowing her to work in conditions that would be dangerous for humans. She could withstand extreme temperatures and had natural resistance to radiation, making her invaluable for the more hazardous repairs. But it was during their off hours that James found himself most drawn to her. Kira had a way of moving through space that was both graceful and purposeful, and her scales created patterns of light and shadow that were mesmerizing to watch. More than that, she understood his dedication to preserving the station's legacy. The Harmonists believed that diversity made civilizations stronger. She said one evening as they shared a meal in the restored dining area, "My people used to believe that too, before the hegemony convinced us that unity meant conformity." "What changed your mind?" James asked. Kira's scales darkened to a deep blue sadness. He'd learned. "I was ordered to help design weapons specifically targeted at non-draconian physiology, biological agents that would kill other species while leaving us unharmed." She looked out at the stars through the viewport. "I realized that wasn't strength. It was cowardice." James reached across the table and took her hand. Her scales were warm, almost feverish to his touch, but she didn't pull away. "You gave up everything to preserve what you believed in. That takes real courage, as did you," Kira replied, her scales shifting to that golden tone again. "Staying here, maintaining this place, you're keeping alive the idea that different species can coexist, even thrive together." The attraction between them had been building for weeks, expressed in small touches, lingering glances, and the comfortable intimacy of shared work. But that night, as they watched the stars together, it finally reached a tipping point. "Draconian mating bonds are intense," Kira said quietly. not quite looking at him. Once formed, they're permanent. My people don't engage in casual intimacy. Neither do I, James replied honestly. I mean, I haven't exactly had opportunities lately, but even before, I've always needed emotional connection for physical attraction to work. Kira turned to face him fully, her amber eyes searching his face. Are you saying you want that kind of connection with me, instead of answering with words? James cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. Her lips were warmer than human normal, and he could taste something faintly spicy, like cinnamon and starlight. Kira responded immediately, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, her claws carefully controlled to avoid scratching his skin. When they broke apart, her scales were cycling through multiple colors: gold, silver, deep emerald, creating a living aurora across her skin. That's beautiful, James breathed, tracing one of the patterns with his fingertip. It's involuntary, Kira admitted, her voice slightly embarrassed. Draconians can't hide our emotions during intimacy. Every feeling shows on our skin. I like that, James said sincerely, no pretense, no hiding. Just honest reaction. They made love slowly that night, exploring each other with the careful attention of engineers examining a complex system. Kira's scales created patterns of light that reflected off the metal walls, turning their coupling into something that was part physical pleasure, part light show, part spiritual connection. James discovered that Draconian anatomy was wonderfully compatible with human, but with intriguing differences that kept him fascinated. Kira's internal temperature was higher. Her response is more visually dramatic, her stamina seemingly endless, but beyond the physical, he could feel something deeper forming between them. The kind of bond that Kira had warned him was permanent among her people. I can feel it happening, she whispered as they moved together, her scales now cycling through colors he'd never seen before. The bonding. Are you sure this is what you want? Yes, James said without hesitation. I've been alone long enough. When they finally lay still, exhausted and satisfied, Kira's scales had settled into a steady golden glow that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. James traced the patterns lazily, marveling at how right this felt. So what happens now? He asked. Kira smiled, her expression more peaceful than he'd ever seen it. Now we rebuild. Not just the station, but everything it represented. A place where different species can work together, love together, create something better than what either could achieve alone. James kissed her forehead, tasting the slight metallic sweetness of her skin. The harmonists would approve. They would. Kira agreed, settling more comfortably against his chest. And maybe someday, others will find their way here too. Others who believe that diversity is strength, that love transcends species. Outside their viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small triumph of connection happening aboard the forgotten station. But for James and Kira, wrapped in each other's arms and surrounded by the slowly warming corridors of their sanctuary, it felt like the entire universe had shifted to accommodate their newfound bond. The station's systems hummed quietly round them, no longer just maintaining life support, but nurturing something new, hope for a future where love could flourish without fear, where the connections that made beings stronger would be celebrated rather than destroyed. 2 years had passed since the first desperate plea echoed across Europa's ice fields, and the hidden colony that had grown in response bore little resemblance to the scattered refugees who had once sought sanctuary in isolation. The settlement, built into a network of connected biodomes on a distant moon, hummed with the quiet energy of beings who had found not just safety, but purpose. Marcus stood in the central plaza, watching children play in the artificial sunlight, some human, some clearly alien, and others whose mixed heritage spoke to the bonds that had formed between species. Zara approached from the medical center, her bioluminescent patterns now a familiar comfort after months of shared nights and deeper connection. The latest arrivals are settling in well, she reported, slipping her hand into his. 3 more mixed pairs this week, all seeking the same thing. We found a place where love doesn't have to hide. Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling the warm pulse of energy that always passed between them. David's linguistic work is paying off. Word is spreading through the underground networks. In the distance, they could see David and Nix working together in the archives. their mental connection allowing them to process ancient texts at remarkable speed. The knowledge they uncovered had become the philosophical foundation for the colony proof that interspecies bonding wasn't just possible, but beneficial for all involved. "How's Vera's project coming along?" Zara asked, gesturing toward the agricultural domes where the Nexari healer worked with Thomas to develop new methods of cultivation, better than expected. Marcus replied, "Their healing-enhanced agriculture is producing yields that shouldn't be possible, and they're training others in their techniques." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention back to the playground, where young ones of various species played together with the unconscious ease that their parents had had to learn. Among them, Marcus could see the signs of the bonds that were already forming the way a human child instinctively comforted a crying Zephyrian. How an Althean youth naturally shared emotions with her mixed group of friends. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is real," Zara said softly. "When I first arrived at your station, I was so desperate, so certain that I was the last of my kind who would ever know true bonding. You were never alone." Marcus replied, drawing her closer. "You just hadn't found us yet." They were interrupted by James and Kira approaching from the engineering section, their body language speaking to the deep partnership they'd forged. Kira's scales displayed the contented golden glow that had become her default since bonding, while James carried himself with a confidence that had been missing during his solitary years. "Council meeting in an hour," James announced. "We've got 3 new settlement requests to consider, and Kira's completed the plans for the next dome expansion. Any word from the outer networks?" Marcus asked. Kira's scales shifted to a more serious blue-green. "Mixed news. The hegemony is still expanding, still targeting bonded species, but resistance is growing. Other settlements like ours are forming, and some former hegemony worlds are beginning to question the prohibition on interspecies connection." They walked together toward the council chamber, passing through sections of the settlement that showcased what could be achieved when different species worked together. The medical center, where Nexari healing techniques had revolutionized healthcare. The workshops where human engineering combined with alien innovation. The cultural centers where traditions from a dozen worlds were preserved and shared. The council chamber itself was a testament to the colony's principles, a circular room where no seat held precedence, where decisions were made through consensus rather than hierarchy. As the various community leaders gathered, Marcus reflected on how different this was from the isolation they'd all known before. "First order of business," announced Kira, who had been elected as the current session moderator. "The Titan settlement request. They're offering significant resources in exchange for our agricultural and healing knowledge." David looked up from his notes, his mental link with Nick's allowing him to speak for both of them. "We've analyzed their cultural patterns. They show genuine commitment to interspecies cooperation, not just opportunistic alliance seeking." "What about security concerns?" asked Dr. Elena Vasquez, a human psychologist who had arrived 3 months earlier with her draconian partner. "Titan's proximity to major shipping lanes could draw unwanted attention." Vera, her healing abilities having restored her to vibrant health, leaned forward. "The medical benefits alone justify the risk. They have 3 different species suffering from isolation-related illnesses. We could save hundreds of lives." Thomas nodded in agreement. "And their botanical resources would allow us to expand our food production significantly. We're already at capacity here." The discussion continued for hours, but Marcus found himself only half listening to the specifics. Instead, he was struck by the fundamental change in how these conversations happened. No one spoke only for their own species' interests. The bonds they'd formed had created a true community where everyone's welfare was considered. When the votes were cast, the Titan settlement was approved unanimously. Similar consensus was reached on the other proposals, and plans were made for the next phase of expansion. As the formal session ended, the group naturally broke into smaller clusters, continuing conversations and deepening the connections that made their governance possible. Later that evening, as the settlement's lights dimmed to simulate nightfall, Marcus and Zara walked through the residential area toward their shared quarters. Round them, they could see other couples through transparent dome sections. David and Nick sharing one of their mental communions, James and Kira working together, On some engineering project, Vera and Thomas tending to the garden that had become their shared passion. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never found each other? Zara asked as they paused at their door. Marcus considered the question seriously. I think we would have survived separately, but we never would have truly lived inside their quarters. They settled into the evening routine that had become sacred to them, sharing the day's experiences, not just through words, but through the deeper connection that Zephyrian bonding allowed. As Zara's bioluminescence painted patterns on the walls, Marcus felt the familiar sense of completeness that came from being truly known by another being. The next generation won't have to choose between love and safety, Zara murmured as they prepared for sleep. They'll grow up knowing that connection is natural, that differences make us stronger. Marcus nodded, pulling her close. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just that we survived, but that we're building something that will outlast us. Outside their window, the artificial stars of the dome's ceiling cycled through their programmed night sky, while beyond the transparent barriers, the real stars shone with ancient light. Somewhere among those distant suns, other beings were likely struggling with the same questions of connection and survival that had brought this community together. But here, in this small corner of the galaxy, they had found an answer. Love did transcend species. Trust could bridge any gap. And when beings chose to bond rather than fight, they created something stronger than any military force or political system. As Marcus drifted off to sleep beside the alien woman who had become his heart, he smiled at the memory of her first desperate plea. She had asked what she needed to do to bond with him, but the answer had been simpler than either of them imagined. They had simply needed to choose each other again and again, until that choice became as natural as breathing. The settlement slept peacefully round them, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rivals, new opportunities to prove that love was not just possible between species, but essential for the survival of all. In the medical records of the colony, there was no mention of the word alien anymore. There were Zephyrians and humans, Altheans and Draconians, Nexari and dozens of other species, but they were all simply neighbors, friends, lovers, family. The desperate plea that had echoed across Europa's ice fields had been answered not by a single human, but by an entire community dedicated to the radical idea that connection was stronger than fear, that love was more powerful than prejudice, and that the bonds between beings could light up the darkness between the stars.